Hello, welcome. In this video, I'm going to give you a mini lesson on the 19th century novel. Okay, so this relates to any of these books, and if you are doing GCSE English, you will study one of these books. You may actually end up studying more than one, but you'll only have one in your final exam. So the most popular are Jekyll and Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson and A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Now, the approach I'm going to take here is quite different to perhaps what you've seen before. I do not believe, because I know from 6 years of experience, that the main thing that will help you get better marks is how many quotes you learn. It ain't, right? Doesn't matter. The main thing that's going to make the most difference is how well you analyze and evaluate those quotes. In fact, it's often better to use short quotes and link them together than memorize loads of stuff. And I see so many students just spending hours and hours trying to memorize all of this stuff, all of this information. They think, oh, I just get all these quotes learned and get them all accurate and I'll get better marks. Doesn't always work. You need to know some, but the main thing is how well you analyze, and I'm going to show you the biggest way to improve your analysis today by connecting it to the big themes and ideas that were happening at the time of the 19th century, which, by the way, get this one clear once and for all, the 19th century is the 1800s, yeah? Because we're in the 21st century. The first century after Jesus was the zeros, yeah? Year zero. So this is the 21st century. The 19th century was the 1800s. Okay, so we're talking today about the 19th century novel, which for most of you would be A Christmas Carol or Jekyll and Hyde. But it could also be any of these books. I know a few students do Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice, The Side of Four. I've never seen anyone doing this, Silas Marner, but I know that it exists on the Edexcel syllabus. Right, so first thing we need to understand here is that to analyse these books effectively, you've got to know that the writers were not just writing stuff for no reason. They were writing stuff to influence the society they lived in. So writers today have got opinions about stuff that is going on in the world, right? Writers today have got opinions about COVID-19, about Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, about the price of petrol, stuff that's happening right now that people are worried about. They've got opinions about it. The same was the case in the 1800s, and it's always the case that writers have got opinions and they've got messages about stuff that is happening in their society. And that, in a nutshell, is what context is. So people will tell you, oh, context means you've got to learn all of the history of that time, right? It's not really how it works. Context means that you just get the idea that a writer's got an opinion about stuff happening in the time they're living in. And yeah, you need to know something about what that stuff was. But what you don't necessarily need is to memorize loads of historical facts. It's not a history exam, and I'm not going to make you memorize that stuff. What I'm going to show you is how to use it to improve your analysis, using a few examples. So, if that is all clear so far, just like this video. Let's move on. First thing we're going to talk about then, generally, what is context? Well, it's two things. Historical context is what was happening at the time and how it affected the writer, or, here's an important one, the reader. So, for example, a reader now who reads A Christmas Carol, and many of you will have heard of Scrooge, even if you've not read the book A Christmas Carol. It's very famous, loads of films of it, hates Christmas, hates everyone really, and eventually changes his mind because of four ghosts that visit him and make him a nicer person. So Scrooge now is like a symbol of a nasty person. It's obvious Scrooge is bad, evil, until he changes. But back then, Dickens wrote this book because the attitude Scrooge had of, not wanting to help anyone, poor people are lazy, they should all starve to death, and he says this in the book. The attitude that he has was actually a real attitude many people at the time had. Now that meant that a reader reading that book was supposed to be shocked. They were supposed to look at themselves in the mirror and see part of themselves in Scrooge and think, well, this is actually really bad. Do I really believe that all poor people are just lazy? I mean, Scrooge seems pretty nasty. He's a terrible person, and that's kind of his whole thing, right? Is just looking after yourself and not caring about others. Maybe I should change my mind. Whereas now we look at it and no one really agrees with Scrooge's opinions. So now it's just Scrooge is like a joke almost. We still like the story of an miserable old man becoming kinder and happier, but yeah, it's not as controversial as it was then. So the reader's reaction is different, okay? That's so important to understand. It's not just the writer's opinion, it's the reader's reaction. So a good way to use context is just to say, well, a reader now, a contemporary reader would think this, but a reader back then would have felt that, and just say the difference. Okay, also the literary context, you need to also relate your answers to what's happening in other parts of the book. If they ask you to write about one extract, then you will write about it better if you understand what's happening in other parts of the book. Right, quick note, if you're doing Edexcel, please don't go on about all this stuff they tell you that, oh, in the first part, you can't talk about the rest of the book, and in the second part, you can't talk about the extract. I mean, look, the point is, you can't properly analyse that extract unless you understand what's happening in the rest of the book. You don't have to write about it and go on about it, but you have to understand it as background knowledge. Also, even if you've got a question where the mark scheme says they don't give you marks for context, you'll still understand it better if you understand that there was a lot of poverty in Charles Dickens' time, and many people were harsh towards the poor, and that's why he wrote A Christmas Carol. You can understand that a lot better. You don't have to give all the facts about the years different laws were passed, but you can understand it better and write a better answer, even if they're not giving you marks for context. So just get all of that bad advice out of your head. Right, so 19th century. We're going to talk about a few important things that were happening then and how you can relate it to these books. First of all, the Industrial Revolution. So industrial means to do with industry or making stuff. Revolution is when something changes a lot, a big change. So began actually in the previous century, the 1700s is the 18th century, it's always one more. And this is when factories were growing and industry, so by the 1830s, Manchester, for example, made 80% of all the world's cotton. And that meant that some people who owned the factories got very rich, and the people who didn't often got poor. Why? Well, because they all moved into the cities. They used to be farmers, they moved into the cities, they were overcrowded, dirty, full of disease. Also, if you used to make stuff by hand, if you used to make clothes by hand, they open up a big new factory to make them a lot cheaper, guess what? You're out of a job. Just like people now might be out of a job because they get replaced by a robot or artificial intelligence. Wasn't good for those people. So, there was terrible poverty at the time. How did society react? How did the government react? Well, they passed a law, the Poor Law, which said that if you don't have enough money to feed yourself or feed your family, you can either die and starve to death, or you can go to the workhouse. And the workhouse was like a prison, because the families were separated, you had to work really hard, you got just enough food to survive, it was a terrible place to go. And Scrooge, in A Christmas Carol, he, at the start of the book, speaks to two men collecting money for charity. And they say, well, are you going to give any money for charity? It is Christmas. And then he says, well, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And he's sarcastically telling them, well, okay, the poor should just go to the prison or the workhouse. And then they say, well, many people would rather die than go to the workhouse, which was understandable because they were awful. And Scrooge says, well, okay, if they'd rather die, they'd better do it quickly and reduce the surplus population. The surplus population, surplus means too much, population means the number of people, was a theory which was invented by a guy called Thomas Malthus. Sometimes it's called the Malthusian theory. And this theory said that if you help poor people by giving to charity, they're going to live longer and they're going to have more kids. And that means, guess what? More poor people are going to be around in the future, right? It was like they're like vermin, they're like rabbits, they'll just breed more. And there'll be less food to go around. More people, less food, poverty gets worse. So it was a justification for not giving to charity, not helping people, and making them go to the workhouse instead of helping them. And it said that if you help them, you'll make things worse. And Scrooge believes that. And many, many people at the time believed that. And they believed this was the right approach. So when they read about Scrooge, who was like a terrible person, he hates Christmas, doesn't love his own family, no one likes him, is icy, cold, miserable. This was supposed to make you think, well, okay, is that how we're all becoming? Are we all ending up like Scrooge? If we believe this as well? That was the whole point of the book, to mock that attitude and really make people feel bad about it. Whereas now, no one really agrees with that anyway, right? Like, there's still different points of view about how much society should help the poor and how much it's the individual's own responsibility. It's a big debate, but no one really says, well, let them starve anymore. So that's why the reader's reaction is different. So you have to understand that Dickens was writing this book to actually change society and make us more compassionate towards poorer people. And not just say it's your own fault, you're lazy, or there's too many poor people and the surplus population is getting too big, but actually to have a different attitude. Okay, another link you can make, by the way, in Jekyll and Hyde, so this is also linked into social class, because the main characters, Jekyll and Hyde, of course, who, spoiler alert, is Jekyll, his evil side, he splits his personality in half, creates an evil side that is Hyde, who eventually takes over the good side. And Mr. Utterson, his friend, they're all like middle-class, wealthy kind of people. And then Hyde, guess what Hyde does to have fun, right? And the whole point of this book is that Jekyll split his personality partly because he wanted to do stuff that society didn't approve of. And he doesn't really spell out what that is in the book because you couldn't talk about those things very politely in Victorian times in the 19th century. It's probably drugs, alcohol, sex, that kind of thing. So Hyde goes into the poorer parts of London, like Soho, to have a good time, basically. And he's kind of exploiting poorer people, poorer women, like prostitutes probably, and taking advantage of them. And so these attitudes are reflected in that book as well. Right, so the other thing I'm going to tell you about is, let's focus on science. Okay, so science is a great one that you can link to Jekyll and Hyde. Now, you're probably aware in some way that in the 1800s, many people were more religious than they are now. Christianity was very important. Now, obviously, they talk about religion, Christianity, in A Christmas Carol. I mean, Christmas, Christmas, is about Jesus, even though many people celebrate it that are not religious now. But Scrooge is like, bah humbug, I don't care about Christmas. And says, well, why should I make lazy people merry, right? Why should I make idle people merry? And so Dickens is kind of saying, well, this is like not a good value, this is against Christianity, and we should actually, as Christians, be more compassionate. But this connects into science as well. Okay, so you might not have noticed this in A Christmas Carol, it's not super obvious, but it's definitely there. There was actually a BBC adaptation of A Christmas Carol 3 or 4 years ago, I think, where it's really interesting because they changed it a lot, and Scrooge, the character Scrooge, did this experiment where he got Bob Cratchit's wife to agree to sleep with him for money to feed Tiny Tim, and then said, I don't want to sleep with you anyway, but gave her the money, just as a test. And the point is that Scrooge has this very scientific attitude that applies to people as well, and he believes in like testing people and using logic and science, and he's a business person, so he's like, well, we've got to be logical and rational, figure things out, and not be too emotional. For example, this whole theory of the surplus population was supposed to be scientific. They used to call the science of economics, the study of the economy and money and stuff like food and resources, they used to call it the dismal science because it was pretty depressing, this idea that actually if we give to charity, we're going to make things worse. It's not a nice idea. So Scrooge is trying to use science against the poor and against charity and maybe against Christianity. And this is a whole debate that Dickens is actually interested in. So more obviously though, in Jekyll and Hyde, science is a big theme. So Charles Darwin, you probably heard of him, you probably heard of evolution. Darwin said that humans evolved from monkeys, which possibly meant that they weren't created by God, or at least not as we are now, even if God was involved somewhere in the process. And that made a lot of people pretty upset, because they thought, well, no, the Bible says God created Adam and Eve. Okay, big debate at that time. Now, when Stevenson, the author of Jekyll and Hyde, describes Hyde, he calls him ape-like, right? He says that Hyde is like an ape, like a monkey, like the missing link between monkeys and humans. So this is another way in which science is portrayed as potentially dangerous or threatening. Think about Jekyll too. He uses science, he uses chemistry to divide his personality. What happens to him? Well, Hyde, the evil side of his personality, becomes stronger and stronger and takes over, and Jekyll ends up dead, because Hyde commits a murder, and then he kills himself before the police can get to him, and then Jekyll dies too, because they're the same person, sharing a body. Okay, so what's the point of all this? Well, is Stevenson trying to say that science is dangerous? That it goes against religious values? Don't mess with God's creation. People say this today about, like, genetic engineering, for example. You're playing God. Don't mess with the human mind, because if you believe in Christianity or many other religions, there's a soul that survives after your death and goes to heaven or hell. So you don't want to mess with the human mind if you believe in that by trying to use science to divide it in half. Or is he just saying, well, science is a great tool for good, but we have to be careful, don't abuse it, right? So the point is, these writers were interested in the debates at their time about wealth and poverty, about industry, about science, about religion. And if you understand those debates, as you probably do a bit more now you've watched this video, you'll write better analysis. Do you need to know the year that Charles Darwin wrote his book? No. Do you need to know the year that the new Poor Law was passed? No. Do you need to know in general that what a workhouse was and the fact there was poverty? Yes. And do you need to know roughly what Darwin and evolution was about and notice the references to it in Jekyll and Hyde? Yes. So that's what I want you to get from this video, to take away what context really is, what analysis really is, and why that's more important than how many quotes you memorize. Because one quote analysed well is better than 10 quotes you don't analyse at all. Hope that helps. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe as well. I've got more videos on other books, other parts of English, and I'll see you very soon.